So our next speaker is Rasmus Kleis Nielsen. Rasmus is director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism and professor of political communication at the University of Oxford. He was previously director of research at the Reuters Institute and editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Press Politics. His work focuses on changes in the news media, on political communication, and the role of digital technologies in both. He's done extensive research on journalism, American politics, and various forms of activism, and a significant amount of comparative work in Western Europe and beyond. Welcome, Rasmus. Pleasure to have you, and the floor is yours when you're ready.
Thank you so much, Maya, and thanks to you in particular and the whole team for the invitation to speak today. I always love these interdisciplinary conversations. So I will start sharing my slides here. What I want to speak about today briefly is public perspectives on quote-unquote fake news and misinformation, and what these public perspectives might tell us about both automated and regulatory responses. So the starting point really for my talk today is that obviously many of us who are part of a conversation like this are from sort of research environments. We are interested in achieving sort of the best obtainable version of the truth in terms of the misinformation problems that our societies address in the most sort of precise and reliable knowledge that we can find on this and produce on this. Now, I think there are two other important perspectives that we should take into account as we move from those insights into practical responses, whether policy or automated. One is sort of the policymaker perspective. What are the things for which there might be a democratic mandate from elected officials and other relevant legitimate stakeholders involved in these discussions? And the second one, and the one I want to focus on today, is what are the public perspectives in this? What do citizens think about this? What does the public, whom ultimately we would like to sort of help navigate problems of misinformation, think about the problems that we face today? And I suppose that the sort of the sweet spot that we would hope to find when we respond to problems of misinformation is the overlap between the three of them, which is where I think we can say that what Helge Novotny, the sociologist who was also once the president of the European Research Council, calls socially robust knowledge resides. So socially robust knowledge that isn't only reliable in the sense that science aspires to, but is also accepted as relevant and accepted by the actors in the context of its application. So that is insight into misinformation that is based on research, and in that sense is reliable as science aims to be, but also has this sort of acceptance as relevant and credible in the eyes of policymakers and the public. Now, if we want to sort of understand where sort of public perceptions fit into this and how it might align with research and with policymaking, I'll suggest sort of a very simple way of thinking about where we are with misinformation research. I think everyone I know of would put platforms at the center of this if we want to sort of understand where we are with misinformation in our societies. People have somewhat different views on whether platforms play a sort of a larger or smaller role in these problems, but everyone I know of would put platforms at the center of it. Now, but beyond that consensus, I think there are also areas where we may not yet agree and where perhaps there are sort of meaningful differences also amongst reasonable people. One axis would be between what I would think of as sort of narrow definition of misinformation and others would be sort of broad definitions of misinformation. So at the one end, you have sort of essentially researchers who are primarily focused on misinformation as content coming from a list of sort of identified domains that have repeatedly shared false and misleading information. And at the other end, you have sort of a broader conception of the issues we face as sort of problematic information that can be misleading, but may not be demonstrably untrue, for example, and can sometimes be sort of more malinformation, misinformation. That's one. The other axis would be sort of where one sees the sort of the most important drivers of the issues that we face. Is it primarily an issue sort of top down? Is it driven by domestic politicians, by some media organizations, by information operations of foreign governments? Or is it perhaps more driven by bottom up issues of activists or various groups of ordinary people whose behavior may be amplified by ranking algorithms and the like on platforms, but where fundamentally it's about users who are not themselves sort of powerful organized interests driving misinformation. Now, I'll return to this sort of simplistic map of misinformation research after having talked a little bit about what I think we know at this stage about how the public sees these problems. The reason I want to talk about the public is that in addition to the really important work of identifying examples of false or misleading information, assessing its impact and assessing the efficacy of various forms of responses to it, whether automated or sort of artisanal, if you will, as sort of fact-checking or corrections, I think there is a really important issue here about the extent to which these analyses are aligned with the way in which citizens understand these issues. How do they think of problems of misinformation? Because the credibility of responses will in part rely on whether our responses are aligned not just with what's effective, but also with what people see as being the nature of the problems we are trying to address. As anyone who's ever worked with sort of migration policy or criminal justice policy or anything else would say, it's not enough to have science on your side. You also need to sort of be able to connect that with the way in which the public see these issues. And I think that goes for misinformation as well. So how does the public think about misinformation? Well, I mean, first of all, to state the obvious, people are very worried about this. When we survey people across the world in the Reuters Institute Digital News Report last year across 40 markets, on average, more than half of our respondents say that they are concerned or very concerned about whether the news they come across online is real or fake. There's significant variation from country to country, but overall, the levels of concern are very, very high in most countries. But of course, underneath the hood, this gets very complicated very quickly, as all of you who are part of this conversation know well from your own practical work and your own research. But I think it's really important to recognize that the public sees this complexity as well. In 2018, we explored this complexity through qualitative research at the Reuters Institute. We ran focus groups in a number of countries and asked people to provide examples of what the term fake news meant to them. And I will just summarize the responses here, which, as those of you who do qualitative work know, is always sort of complicated and very nuanced, but I think it's possible to arrive at sort of an inductive typology of the types of things that people mention when they're asked to reflect on the concept of fake news. One is sort of satire, but people will quickly say, well, it might sort of be both fake and look like it's news, but of course we know that it's not actually fake news because it's not meant to deceive, if you will, but it sort of comes up in the conversation with citizens. Beyond that, troublingly, for someone like myself who studies journalism and believes that with its imperfections, evidence suggests that it plays an important role in our societies, people very quickly turn to examples of what they see as poor journalism, superficial journalism, inaccurate journalism, sensationalist journalism, as examples of what the term fake news means to them. Then people move on quite quickly to what we might think of as sort of political propaganda. This is sort of hyper-partisan content, whether it's from politicians who are lying or extreme spin and PR from self-interested powerful organizations, or for that matter, hyper-partisan forms of punditry and commentary in media organizations. This is also an example from the point of view of the public of what people think are examples of fake news. Then we have some forms of advertising, some of the sort of around the web links and types of sponsored content that we all encounter on many sites on the web are examples of what people would think of as fake news when asked to reflect on this term. And only finally do we get to sort of false news, what researchers and journalists might think of as sort of the core of the issue of quote unquote fake news, the sort of things that are fabricated, whether for profit or for political motivations. And again, here people would say, well, that's not really news at all. So they sort of screen it out from the sort of the folk theory of what fake news is. The reason I offer you all this is to sort of illustrate, if you will, that from the point of view of the public, the distinction between sort of news and fake news is not a binary, it's a gray zone. And it sort of shades in to things on which each of us may have a slightly different interpretation or even refuse to contemplate one of these categories as an example of fake news. But from the point of view of much of the public, poor journalism, political propaganda, and some forms of advertising are, in fact, from their point of view, examples of fake news. Now, this is all qualitative work. What does it look like in terms of the people's experience of whether they come across these things and how concerned they are about them? We built on the focus groups we had run to include a survey question to try to get at this in the digital news report the year after we had done it in 2018. I want to stress here that the data I'm about to present is not a measure of sort of the objective spread of scale and scope of different kinds of misinformation. It's data on public opinion, on whether people say they're exposed to it and how concerned they are about it. What does it look like? Well, first of all, there are high levels of concern about hybrid partisan sort of political propaganda. There are high levels of concern about false news, things that are fabricated. And there are high levels of concern about poor journalism, as well as sort of the use of the term fake news to attack the news media and discredit the media. But when we look at what people say they're actually exposed to themselves, it's a much smaller number of people who say that they're actually exposed to fabricated information than say they're exposed, for example, to poor journalism or hyperpartisan content. So high levels of concern about many of these categories, but from the point of view of people's personal experience, they are much more likely to say they've been exposed to political propaganda or what they see as examples of poor journalism. And when we take this into account, I think it's unsurprising that when we then ask people about sort of who should take action to address these issues, in fact, publishers come out sort of number one as the entity that most people identify as who they think should do something. Platforms come next, and government a little bit later down the list, with very meaningful geographic variation between sort of Europe, where there is some appetite for government intervention, the majority would ask government to intervene, versus the United States, where in 2018 it was less than half who felt that the government should sort of take a direct action in addressing problems of misinformation. Now, very quickly, in terms of where the sort of the focus of concern is from the point of view of the public, again, I'm not saying this is an objective measure of where the problems are most severe from the point of view of sort of demonstrable spread of demonstrably false information with demonstrably harmful effects, but it's about understanding what this looks like from the point of view of the public, so we can ensure how we respond is effective, ideally, but ideally also credible in addressing the concerns that people actually have. Well, when we look first at the sources of false and misleading information, people say they're most concerned about, focus is really focused on domestic politicians. This is from last year in the Digital News Report, average across 40 markets, and we looked at 40% identify domestic politicians as the source of potentially false and misleading information they say they're most concerned about. If we then break it down by sort of political orientation, we see some really significant differences. In the United States, last year, there was very high levels of concern over domestic politicians on the political left. Gee, I wonder who they're thinking about. Somewhat lower levels of concern on the right. And then a very, very striking difference that on the left, there was almost no concern about journalists and news organizations as a source of potentially false and misleading information, but very high concern on the right, in fact, higher than concern over politicians. The UK, just for comparison, is a bit different. Very, very high concern about domestic politicians as a source of false and misleading information. Again, gee, I wonder who they might have been thinking of. Much lower on the political right. And then in the UK, across the political spectrum, importantly, much lower levels of concern about journalists and news organizations. If we turn then some potential sources of false and misleading information to potential platforms for false and misleading information, what does public concern look like? Facebook is by far number one, a clear number one across the markets we covered last year in our survey research. 29% identified this as the platform they say they're most concerned about. I think the fact that YouTube is so low at just 6% is a reminder that public perception of scale and scope of problems isn't always necessarily sort of aligned with what an objective measure might suggest. But more broadly, I mean, sort of Facebook corporate across Big Blue and messaging applications is the sort of the central point of public concern as platforms. But also, if we look at the question we have on sources of news websites or apps, we've got 22% of our respondents identifying that as the sort of platform where they are concerned about false and misleading information. Again, just very quickly looking at political breakdowns. In the United States last year, very, very widespread concern about Facebook on the political left. A majority of our respondents singled out Big Blue. Much lower levels of concern on the right, but significant concern. When it comes to news, again, as before, much lower levels of concern on the left, much higher concerns on the right, where there are more people in the political right who are concerned about false and misleading information from news organizations than from Facebook. The UK, as before, much less polarized picture, but higher levels of concern on the left about Facebook. Now, where does that leave us before turning to discussion and people's comments or any questions? If we sort of return to my sort of simple little figure of sort of a way of thinking about where we are with misinformation research, I think it's worth trying to sort of map on where I think we are in terms of how a lot of sort of responses to misinformation, in particular, perhaps in the regulatory and policy circles, approach this, and see how that maps up against what at least our research suggests about how the public thinks about these issues. So I would sort of put to you that at least in much of Europe, public concern about misinformation often is focused on Facebook, it's focused on politicians, and to some extent, it's focused on journalists and news media. It's important to note here that there is no clear public consensus on the scale and scope of these problems or who the main drivers are of these. In that sense, I think it's more, if you will, like public opinion on issues of like migration or criminal justice, where there is very significant sort of disagreement across the public, or at least differences of opinion, than it is like, say, climate change, where there is a much larger degree of public consensus that this is an urgent crisis that requires immediate and determined responses from policymakers. Now, if we compare that to where, at least in my reading, the sort of the policy responses are, I would say that the policy concern, at least in the European Union, often is focused on Facebook. Yes, so in that sense, that's aligned with public opinion, and other platforms, which are not always as central to public opinion, even though they perhaps should be. But quite interestingly, of course, it just happens to be the case that policy concerns are not focused on politicians and journalism and news media, even though our research suggests that from the point of view of the public, these are seen as central parts of the problems of misinformation that we face. And I should just add here that many researchers, I think, would side more with the public than with policymakers in terms of how this is approached. Where are we then with misinformation research and praxis? Well, I mean, I would say that at least our research suggests that perhaps there is a greater overlap between the research bubble and the public bubble than there is between the research bubble and the policy bubble, or indeed the public bubble and the policy bubble here. And I think it's a question that we will have to sort of think about when we move forward, not as researchers. You know, our obligation is to sort of seek truth and report it, to use the sort of the language of my journalist friends, but from the point of view of those who believe in evidence-based policymaking, and also believes that policy, in addition to being evidence-based, needs to be based on sort of broad-based political and public support, is essentially can we get here? And whether we should. Is that in itself an important part of how we address problems with misinformation? I mean, I suppose the subtext, not so subtle, of this presentation is it probably is, in my point of view, in the sense that many of the problematic consequences of misinformation we are concerned about is not just whether there are things on the internet that are false and misleading, which there are many, or whether they sort of are widely distributed, which they also are often, in particular on various platforms, but whether people are in fact A, misinformed, and B, whether they end up being sort of harmed by being misinformed. And I think one of the concerns we have is that misinformation undermines people's confidence and trust in media that they rely upon to navigate their life, make decisions, be active citizens, consumers, take care of one another and people that they care about. And in that sense, I think the risk is if we address misinformation in ways that is not evidence-based, it's not going to be effective. But also if it isn't based on some form of connection with how the public sees these issues, it isn't going to be credible. And if it isn't credible, it might look self-serving. It might look like policymakers are trying to protect themselves and control public discourse. And if it looks self-serving, I think there is a risk that it will even further undermine public confidence and trust in the media environment that people need to be able to navigate infodemics and information disorders and misinformation problems. And in that sense, we risk, I think, sometimes undercutting our own policy objectives if we don't base our approaches on evidence, but also on an understanding of where the actual public is in this. And that's why I want to talk about public understandings of fake news and misinformation today. Thank you for the time to speak now, and I look forward to comments and to the discussion. I'll stop sharing the screen now.